From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
The most important thing is to recolonize Puerto Rico, to bring our people the dignity that they deserve, to bring our people the law that they deserve.
Today, we spend the hour in studio with recently freed, longtime Puerto Rican independence activist Oscar Lopez Rivera. He was in prison for 35 years, much of that time in solitary confinement, before President Obama commuted his sentence in January. On May 17, 2017, less than a month ago, Oscar Lopez Rivera was released.
I want to thank Presidents Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama because they responded to the complaints and demands of our people and commuted the sentences of all our political prisoners.
Oscar Lopez Rivera was convicted on federal charges including seditious conspiracy, conspiring to oppose U.S. authority over Puerto Rico by force. Seditious conspiracy is the same charge Nelson Mandela faced in South Africa. This is Lopez Rivera's first visit to New York City since his release and his first global broadcast interview while here. It coincides with New York's long-standing Puerto Rican Day Parade. This year's organizers chose to honor Lopez Rivera as the parade's first national freedom hero. But after a boycott campaign was organized by a right-wing group funded by donors close to both President Trump and Breitbart News, New York's police chief and a number of corporate sponsors said they would boycott the event. Oscar Lopez Rivera says he will still march, but not as an official honoree, but as a humble Puerto Rican and a grandfather. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Former FBI Director James Comey will tell a Senate panel today that President Trump repeatedly demanded his loyalty and pressured Comey to end a probe into former National Security Advisor General Michael Flynn. Comey, who was fired by President Trump last month amidst a growing FBI investigation into Russia's role in the 2016 U.S. election, released his planned opening remarks to lawmakers Wednesday ahead of today's highly anticipated appearance before the Senate Intelligence Committee. In his statement, Comey reveals he was summoned to the White House for a one-on-one dinner with the president January 27th, where Trump asked whether Comey wished to keep his job before declaring, quote, "I need loyalty. I expect loyalty." Comey states Trump later asked him to lift the cloud of the FBI's investigation into ties between Russia and top Trump officials. Comey also states during a Valentine's Day meeting in the Oval Office, Trump asked other top officials to leave the room before asking Comey to drop the investigation into Michael Flynn, saying, quote, "I hope you can see your way clear to letting this go, to letting Flynn go. He's a good guy," President Trump said. Comey's prepared remarks directly contradict President Trump's denial at a May 18th news conference that he pressured Comey to back down on the FBI's investigation.
Did you at any time urge former FBI Director James Comey in any way, shape, or form to close or to back down the investigation into Michael Flynn? And also, as you look back...
No. Next question.
Comey's appearance on Capitol Hill comes a day after senior national security officials repeatedly ducked questions by Senate Intelligence Committee members over whether President Trump asked them to try to influence former FBI Director Comey's investigation. National Security Advisor Dan Coats repeatedly declined to comment when asked about a Washington Post report that Trump asked him to pressure Comey to ease up on his probe into Michael Flynn. And Maine Independent Senator Angus King pressed unsuccessfully for NSA Director Mike Rogers to answer questions about the report.
I don't understand why you're not answering our questions. You can't, when you were confirmed before the Armed Services Committee, you took an oath. Do you solemnly swear to give the committee the truth, the full truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Yes to that.
And I've also answered that those conversations were classified, and it is not appropriate in an open forum to discuss those classified conversations.
Meanwhile, a pair of House Democrats have drafted articles of impeachment against President Trump. Congress members Brad Sherman of California and Al Green of Texas say Trump is guilty of obstruction of justice for firing the FBI director during an investigation into alleged ties between Russia and top administration officials. This is Democratic Congressmember Al Green of Texas.
The question really is not whether the president has obstructed justice. The question really is whether the president can obstruct justice with impunity. The question is whether the House of Representatives will allow an obstruction of justice with impunity. The president, like all others, is not above the law.
Congressmember Brad Sherman said he joined Congressman Green's call for impeachment in part because his colleague, who's African-American, received a deluge of death threats and racist slurs after he called for Trump's impeachment from the House floor last month. President Trump Thursday formally announced that he will name Christopher Wray to replace James Comey as FBI director. Wray served as Assistant Attorney General under George W. Bush from 2003 to 2005, at a time when the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel signed off on the use of torture against detainees in CIA and military custody. In a statement, ACLU political director Faiz Shakir questioned whether Wray could lead the FBI independently and said, quote, given that Wray touts his deep involvement in the Bush administration's response to the 9/11 attacks, which includes his connections to some of the most unlawful legal memos on Bush-era torture programs, the Senate should press Wray to come clean about his role in the programs. On Capitol Hill, the White House is pressuring senators for a vote on a bill to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act ahead of a congressional recess in July. Speaking from Ohio Wednesday, President Trump praised the House health care bill passed in May, which would bring billions of dollars in tax breaks to wealthy Americans, while adding an estimated $23 million to people in the ranks of the uninsured.
The House of Representatives has done its job. It sent a plan to the Senate, and the Senate is working it over. We spent a lot of time yesterday with Mitch McConnell and a lot of the great senators. They happen to be Republicans because we're having no help. It's only obstruction from the Democrats.
Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said he's confident he'll deliver a vote on health care before the July 4th recess. North Korea has conducted another weapons test, firing several missiles off its east coast. South Korea's military called the missiles a new land-to-ship weapon. The test firings came less than a week after the UN Security Council voted to ratchet up sanctions against North Korea over its nuclear weapons program. In Nigeria, fighters with the Boko Haram movement launched an assault on the city of Maiduguri on Thursday, sending thousands of residents fleeing in panic. One eyewitness said 3 children were struck by bullets during the failed assault. The raid came 6 months after Nigeria's president claimed the militant group had been largely defeated. The continuing violence has hampered relief efforts in northeastern Nigeria, where the UN warns nearly 1.5 million people are on the brink of famine. In climate news, a new study predicts coastal U.S. cities will be deluged by frequent and massive floods unless greenhouse gas emissions are slashed dramatically. Researchers at Princeton and Rutgers University estimate that so-called once-in-a-century floods could become commonplace by 2050, with the risk of major flooding events increasing 40-fold. In the United Kingdom, polls are open today, an election that pits Conservative Prime Minister Theresa May against a resurgent Labour Party led by anti-austerity and anti-war candidate Jeremy Corbyn. On the final day of campaigning, May told voters she's the only candidate to lead Britain out of the European Union, the so-called Brexit.
The question is, who do you trust to have the strong and stable leadership to get the best deal for Britain in Europe? Because Brexit matters. So yes, we need to get the Brexit deal right. Bring back that control of our money, our laws and our borders.
Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn spent Wednesday making a final push for his party's platform of taxing the wealthiest 5% of Britons to pay for universal health care, free university tuition, free childcare, expanded workers' rights and other programs.
Hope that austerity can be ended, that we can stand up to the elites and to the cynics. Hope that we can give our health service, our schools, our police, our social care the money they need and deserve, and need it now.
Prime Minister Theresa May and her Tory party are widely expected to win, but the race has tightened dramatically since May called for snap elections in April. A federal grand jury here in the United States has indicted a journalist from New Mexico on charges he participated in a riot while he covered protests against Donald Trump on Inauguration Day in Washington, D.C. Aaron Cantu, a staff writer at the Santa Fe Reporter, faces 8 felonies, including inciting a riot, participating in a riot, and criminal conspiracy. Cantu previously said he'll plead not guilty. He's one of 2 journalists who continue to face charges over the January 20th protests, where more than 200 people were arrested. The legal support group Defend J20 Resistance says some protesters face up to 75 years in prison. In Montana, the Republican Congressmember-elect Greg Gianforte has apologized and will donate $50,000 to the Committee to Protect Journalists after he was accused of body-slamming a Guardian reporter the day before he was elected to Congress last month. On May 24th, Gianforte slammed reporter Ben Jacobs to the floor and repeatedly punched him after Jacobs tried to ask about the Republican health care plan. Gianforte still faces a misdemeanor assault charge, which carries a maximum 6-month jail term. In St. Paul, Minnesota, a police use of force expert said from the witness stand Wednesday there was absolutely no reason for Officer Geronimo Yanez to open fire on Philando Castile during a traffic stop last year, as Yanez's trial on manslaughter charges entered its 3rd day of testimony. Prosecutors opened the trial by playing a police dash cam video of Castile's killing. It shows Officer Yanez opening fire on Castile 7 times. A medical expert testified Castile was struck with 5 of the rounds, including 2 which pierced his heart. Castile's death was live-streamed on Facebook by his girlfriend, Diamond Reynolds, in an extraordinary video in which she narrated the aftermath of the shooting while she was still in the car, with Officer Yanez pointing a gun at her and her 4-year-old daughter. In North Miami, Florida, the family of Arnaldo Rios, a highly autistic man who was shot at by police, has filed suit in federal court, claiming officers endangered his life, interrogated him without a caretaker present, and handcuffed him for hours after shooting his behavioral therapist in the leg. Video of the incident shows Charles Kinsey, an unarmed African-American therapist, lying on his back when he was shot by North Miami police, who were aiming at Rios. At the time of the shooting, Kinsey was helping to calm Rios, who'd wandered away from his group home. In the video, Kinsey is seen lying on his back with his hands in the air, telling police all he has is a toy truck, a toy truck. And the Black Lives Matter movement has won the 2017 Sydney Peace Foundation Prize. The award cites leaders Patrisse Cullors, Alicia Garcia, and Opal Tometi, who began organizing under the hashtag Black Lives Matter campaign in 2013, when White Neighborhood Watch vigilante George Zimmerman was acquitted in Florida of murdering unarmed African-American teenager Trayvon Martin. Past winners of the Sydney Peace Foundation Prize include former Irish President Mary Robinson, South Africa's Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and renowned activist Noam Chomsky. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. Today, we spend the hour with longtime Puerto Rican independence activist Oscar López Rivera, who was imprisoned for more than 35 years, much of the time in solitary confinement, before President Obama commuted his sentence in January. On May 17, 2017, less than a month ago, López Rivera was released. Today, he joins us in our New York studio. Oscar López Rivera was born in San Sebastián, Puerto Rico, and moved with his family to Chicago when he was a boy. He was drafted into the Army at age 18 and served in Vietnam, for which he was awarded the Bronze Star. Upon his return in 1967, he became a community organizer who fought for bilingual education, jobs, and better housing. During the 1970s and 1980s, he was a leader of the pro-independence group FALN, the Forces of Armed National Liberation. Its members set more than 100 bombs, including one attack on Francis Tavern in New York City that killed 4 people. He was never charged, however, with setting those bombs. Instead, in 1981, López Rivera was convicted on federal charges that included seditious conspiracy, conspiring to oppose U.S. authority over Puerto Rico by force. In fact, seditious conspiracy is the same charge Nelson Mandela faced. Lopez Rivera described his charges in a rare prison interview in 2006.
I think that the fact that I was charged with seditious conspiracy to overthrow the government of the United States speaks for itself. But the charge in reference to Puerto Ricans has always been used for political purposes. It goes back to 1936, the first time that a group of Puerto Ricans was put in prison was by using the seditious conspiracy charge. And this has always been a strictly political charge used against Puerto Ricans.
In 1999, President Bill Clinton commuted the sentences of 16 members of the FALN. But Lopez Rivera refused at that time to accept the deal because it did not include two fellow activists who have since been released.
This is Oscar Lopez Rivera's first visit to New York City since his release last month, and it coincides with New York's long-standing Puerto Rican Day Parade, which always takes place on the second Sunday of June. This year's organizers chose to honor Lopez Rivera as the parade's first national freedom hero. This prompted the city's police chief and a number of corporate sponsors to boycott the event, including Goya Foods, Coca-Cola, Univision, and Telemundo. As Juan reported in his column for the New York Daily News, a boycott campaign to condemn Lopez Rivera as a terrorist was quietly organized by a right-wing conservative group in Washington, D.C., the Media Research Center, that receives major funding from donors close to both President Trump and to Breitbart News, unquote. Well, Oscar Lopez Rivera says he will still march, but not as an official honoree, simply as a humble Puerto Rican and a grandfather. Over the years, one of Oscar Lopez Rivera's strongest supporters has been Archbishop Desmond Tutu. On Wednesday, Tutu issued a statement in support of his participation in the parade, noting, quote, "Had South Africans and people of the African diaspora allowed others to determine who he would embrace, Mandela would still be in prison and have been stripped of the stature we gave him and that he deserved," unquote. All of this comes as Puerto Rico is in the midst of a bankruptcy process and is preparing to hold a referendum on its political future on Sunday, the same day as the parade. For more, we're joined in studio by Oscar Lopez Rivera. While in prison, he wrote 2 books, Between Torture and Resistance and Letters to Karina. We're also joined by Juan Cartagena, President and General Counsel of Latino Justice. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Oscar Lopez Rivera, how does it feel to be free?
It feels wonderful. It feels completely different than being in prison. For the first time, I can hear the roosters sing early in the morning. I can see my family. I can see my friends. I can see my granddaughter. I recently went to California just to spend a few days with her. I can move around Puerto Rico. So it feels wonderful. It feels a world completely different than the world of prisons.
And all of these years that you were not only in prison, but on solitary for a good portion of that time, I'm wondering, did you have an expectation that you would eventually be freed? And was it a surprise when in early this year you finally got the word that President Obama had commuted your sentence?
Well, one of the things that I never allowed myself to do was to fall into what I call illusory optimism, so I try my best to keep my hope that I will come out of prison, but at the same time prepare for the worst. So on January 17th, when President Obama commuted my sentence, and I was told that my sentence had been commuted, my reaction was not one that was expected because I was prepared for the worst. And it took me about 4 days to really realize that I was on my way out of prison. But it was not a very exciting moment when I was told that President Obama had commuted my sentence.
Now, this wasn't the first commutation. I mean, Bill Clinton also did this, along with a number of your compatriots, right, 16 Puerto Rican independence activists. But you chose not to leave at that time. You could have left more than a decade ago, 2 decades ago.
Well, I believe in principles, and I have never left anyone behind, whether it was in Vietnam, whether it was in the city of Chicago, whether it was in Puerto Rico. And for me, it was important to stay in prison while two of my co-defendants were in prison. Both of them came out by 2010. Both of them were out of prison. And finally, on May 17th, I was finally out of prison. The sentence was commuted 17th of January, but I had to be under home confinement until May 17th. So it was May 17th when I started to walk on the streets of Puerto Rico and to enjoy Puerto Rico.
Juan Cartagena, I wanted to ask you about the campaign to free Oscar Lopez Rivera. It really included a cross-section of all the political persuasions, religious groups in Puerto Rico, and it lasted for a long time. I remember when we were covering the Democratic Convention in Philadelphia, there was a very strong contingent from Chicago and other cities that had come to demonstrate at the Democratic Convention about the issue of finally freeing him. Your sense of the importance of that campaign?
Oh, critically important. Many of us thought that one last hope would have been the Obama administration. Right? We were hoping for a long time that the President Obama would actually commute his sentence. I was following how President Obama was eulogizing Nelson Mandela when he went to the wake in South Africa, talking about how by freeing Mandela, the system also freed itself. And in many ways, I kept using that, and others kept using that kind of quote. We also recognize that this incredible unity that happened in Puerto Rico is hardly ever seen that many times, right? In my own lifetime, I've seen it around Vieques, but rarely have we seen so many political parties, so many faith union members, and activists of all persuasions, of all types, really line up to make sure that Oscar Lopez Rivera was freed. And you don't have the happiness, the joy, and the pride that we have that we finally were able to achieve that. Because, as he said, he's a man of principle. And to work on behalf of a man of principle has always been an honor.
We're going to break and then come back to our discussion with Juan Cartagena, who's President and General Counsel of Latino Justice, and with Oscar Lopez Rivera, Puerto Rican independence activist freed last month after serving 35 years in prison. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back in a minute.
La tuya lo haría igual y fue esa vez la primera que juntos quisimos volar. Más tarde una voz amada gritó con mucha razón: Cuba y Puerto Rico son de un pájaro las dos alas. Cuba y Puerto Rico son de un pájaro las dos alas. Puerto Rico que cayó al mar, que no pudo volar. Yo te invito a mi vuelo y buscamos juntos el mismo cielo. Condiciones que no tienen que ver con tirar un tiro nos abrieron el camino mientras a ti te detienen. Esta tarea inconclusa tenemos que terminar, pues quieren ver el final. Todos los muertos de ambos.
From A Bird, The Two Wings by Pablo Milanes. Here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Our guest is Oscar Lopez Rivera, Puerto Rican independence activist freed last month after serving 35 years in prison. We're also joined by Juan Cartagena, President and General Counsel of Latino Justice. This is the time here in New York City that the Puerto Rican Day Parade is taking place on Sunday. It is also the day, Sunday, that the Puerto Rican referendum will take place in Puerto Rico. Juan?
Well, Oscar, I'd like to ask you about how you see Puerto Rico now, having come out of prison. The last time you were there was over 35 years ago, and now you're seeing a situation with total economic collapse and bankruptcy and an imposed control board by Congress. What do you see as the situation on the island right now, and how it could possibly get out of its enormous crisis?
Puerto Rico is suffering an enormous crisis. Puerto Rico, as I see it, has been set up in a way that there's no way for Puerto Rico to lift itself up economically. First of all, the Junta de Fiscal Control, the Fiscal Control Board, has already spent a lot of money without offering Puerto Rico any remedy to resolve its economic problem. What it has done thus far is extract money from programs such as the University of Puerto Rico, such as the public education system, and other pensions from workers that will definitely make Puerto Rico's economy worse, much worse than it was last year or the year before. And Puerto Rico cannot pay that debt. It's impossible for Puerto Rico to pay that debt, except if every last dollar that the Puerto Rican worker has in his pocket is taken out of his pocket. That is the reality from the economic point of view. Besides that, we have a government in Puerto Rico, a colonial government in Puerto Rico, that has no way offer any incentives to the Puerto Rican people. On the contrary, it offers incentives to foreigners to invest in Puerto Rico. Whoever invests in Puerto Rico is not a Puerto Rican. What happens is that the money that is made in Puerto Rico is taken out of Puerto Rico. That money does not stay in Puerto Rico. It does not help the economy of Puerto Rico. So my way of looking at it is Puerto Rico is in trouble economically, and the Junta de Control Fiscal, the control board that is imposed or has been imposed on Puerto Rico, is really a detrimental, I would dare say, a criminal act on the Puerto Rican people. Now, there are other things in Puerto Rico that I see being positive. For example, I see the students at the university struggling. I see the students at the university trying to do something to preserve or at least protect the university. That is positive. The youth, the Puerto Rican youth represent the future of Puerto Rico, and as long as they are struggling and doing something for the economy, doing something for themselves, doing something for Puerto Rico, there is hope. There is also another element that I see. Puerto Rico, as has been mentioned, is going into or is celebrating a plebiscite, another colonial act, and to justify what? Puerto Rico is not going to become a state, definitely not. And only one political party in Puerto Rico is going on this plebiscite, is participating in this plebiscite. The rest of Puerto Rico is boycotting the plebiscite. That money, $10 million that will be spent on that plebiscite, could go into at least the education system. We could preserve some of those schools that have been closed. 169 public schools are going to be closed. Why not use that money to help those schools? That will be one of the questions that I will ask the governor of Puerto Rico right now. He has been asked. He has no answers.
I was wondering if we can go back in time to your history, what politicized you, where you were born, how you came to head up the FALN, and then your 35 years in prison, how you survived there.
Well, I was born in a very small farm in Puerto Rico. At age 14, I was sent to Chicago to live with my sister. I entered high school. I'm going to make a little story here, so you will probably see my politics. When I was in high school in Chicago, the teacher asked the students to define a hero and why that person was our hero. So I had been, when I entered elementary school in Puerto Rico at age 5, every day we would sing a song that would say that George Washington was to be celebrated because he never said a lie. Okay, so on that particular day, I said that George Washington was my hero because he had never said a lie, and the students started laughing. I thought it was because of my English accent. When the class was over, a fellow student pulled me to the side and he said, "Don't you know that George Washington was a liar? You shouldn't have said that." So indoctrination was taking place in Puerto Rico in a very sophisticated, subtle way. I was deeply and profoundly profoundly indoctrinated into believing that Puerto Rico could never be an independent country, that Puerto Rico could not be self-sufficient, that we would starve to death if the United States would walk out of Puerto Rico. That's how I was influenced for the first 14 years in my life. Then in Chicago, I found myself facing things that I never thought I would face. For example, discrimination for the first time, finding racism for the first time, a real blatant racism, and discrimination when I was trying to find a job. In the military, I also found the same practice. You know, there was racism, there was discrimination. So when I came back home from Vietnam, and for some reason, Vietnam changed my way of life, my way of thinking. I came back from Vietnam, and I found myself obligated to find out what was the reason for being for the war in Vietnam. I found myself more sympathetic with the Vietnamese people than I thought that I would ever be. And little by little, I started to discover what Vietnam had done. For example, I discovered Dien Bien Phu, how the Vietnamese fought against the French, how did they colonize themselves. I came back to Chicago and I found a community of Puerto Rico.
You got a Bronze Star while
I
you
got
were
a
there.
Bronze Star for that.
And what was your brother doing during this time?
Who?
Your brother.
My brother? My brother was studying. But when I came back from Vietnam, I found a community, a Puerto Rican community that was beginning to wake up, to demand to be seen, to be heard, to transcend its marginalization. And I started organizing in the community. At that time, the Young Lords were coming up out of Chicago. It was a street gang that became political. A lot of things were happening in 1967. For example, it was 1967 when Dr. Martin Luther King pronounced himself against the war in Vietnam and called it a criminal war. 1967 was when Muhammad Ali refused to be drafted, and he paid a big price. And 1967 was the first time that I was invited by a nationalist, a Puerto Rican nationalist, to go to his house and listen to some tapes of the nationalists. And one of the tapes was Lolita Lebron, who had gone to Washington the 1st of March 1954. And she said in that interview that she came to Washington not to kill anyone, but to give her life for Puerto Rico. And when I heard that woman say that, I was amazed. I was amazed. And from that moment on, we started working on the campaign to free the 5. There were 5 Puerto Rican political prisoners, and from 1967 on in Chicago, we started to organize a campaign for their release. By that time, Lolita Lebron, Irving Flores, Andrés Figueroa Cordero, Rafael Cancel Miranda had been in prison for 13 years, and Oscar Collazo Lopez had been in prison for 17 years. And we believed that we should do something to win their release. And finally, in 1979, they were released from prison.
I wanted to ask you, when you were in Chicago, you helped to start a school, didn't you, in Chicago? Do I have it right? Luis Gutierrez was a student at that school? Or?
No, Luis Gutierrez was a tutor at the school.
Oh, tutor. Okay.
Yeah.
The now congressman.
Yes. In 1972, we started an alternative high school for high school dropouts. I have been involved in the issue of education since 1967. We fought to get schools built in the community. We fought to bring bilingual education into the schools. We fought to open up the doors at the universities, especially University of Illinois Chicago Circle and Northeastern universities, where programs were implemented to allow Latino students, because it was not only Puerto Ricans, we were also involved in helping the Latino population in general. So those programs still exist. The programs at University of Illinois, the program at Northeastern University, and our high school. Our high school is a really interesting project. It was based on Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and we were hoping that we would get dropouts, put them through a very rigorous educational system, and do it without any funds. What we did, we asked college professors to give us 3 hours for a class, and we the students that were at the university that we had helped to get into the university, we asked them to be tutors. And that's how Congressman Gutierrez got to be a tutor at the high school.
Mm-hmm. So talk about going to prison and what it meant for you in prison. You were in solitary confinement for over 12 years?
I was in solitary confinement for 12 years, 4 months. And first, from 1986, June 1986 in Marion, USP Marion in Illinois until 1994. And then from 1994 to November 1996 in ADX. In ADX, for the first 58 days, I was awakened every half hour. 58 days straight. So that will give you an idea what it is to be in prison, to be under those conditions.
Well, I want to ask you in terms of the reasons for your being in prison. I mean, clearly the big narrative that you're seeing in the commercial media is this was a terrorist, this is a person who's unrepentant, this is a person who never should be allowed to be out free again. It's certainly not celebrated as a hero. The issue of the FALN's campaign of bombings that occurred in that period of time, you're retrospectively looking back at that, how you view that campaign, and how you feel about it now, and also the criticism that some people have that the organization participated in the killing of many innocent people.
First of all, I want to make this point clear. For me, human life is precious. I was in Vietnam. I hope and I pray that I never killed anyone. Now we know, but if you're a soldier, you know when you have shot somebody because there's a field of range that you're covering. And on my path, I never saw anyone being wounded or killed. So I can say that I came home from Vietnam without blood in my hands. I hope so. For me, the issue of human life is precious. Now, I've been asked over and over about the bombings. I've been asked over and over what took place. I can guarantee one thing, that I never participated in an act where we knew that a human life was going to be put in jeopardy, okay? Now, one thing that I want to make very, very clear, Puerto Rico as a colony has every right to its independence. It has every right. And by international law, Puerto Ricans who want to decolonize Puerto Rico can use all the means at their disposal, including the use of force. I'm not advocating for that. Let's make that clear. By 1992, all of us who were in prison have taken a position that we would not promote violence, that we were not going to be active in violence. In 1999, mostly all my co-defendants were released. Up to this time, almost 20 years later, there has not been not a single act, a criminal, any kind of violation committed by my co-defendants. That really should be the measuring point for anything. That should be the way that we should be seen. We left prison, we committed ourselves not to act violently, and thus far, no one can accuse us of doing so. Now, had there been any evidence against any of us, I guarantee you that I wouldn't be here today. Because the federal judge we faced, he told us that if the law would allow it, he would sentence all of us to death, if the law would allow it. And that sometimes the narrative is never talked about, but there's a narrative. Colonialism is a crime against humanity. We have to be clear on that. And Puerto Ricans, to tolerate colonialism, we are tolerating a crime. So I think that it's important to understand that we love Puerto Rico. I love my homeland. That's my homeland. That's my promised land. And the way I see it is that we have to decolonize Puerto Rico. Now, the issue of violence is no longer one that we'll ever entertain or that we'll ever promote. And let's be clear on that, because I think that it's important for people to know who we are as people. as human beings because we love our homeland. We also love justice and freedom for the whole world.
I wanted to ask you then, along with that, the controversy now that we've had over the last few weeks, and which I believe people don't realize, there's Puerto Rican Day parades all over the United States, and I think you're supposed to be participating the following Sunday in the Chicago Puerto Rican Day parade. So, and Philadelphia has one, Boston, you know, all these cities. So there could be conceivably be this same controversy arriving in every city if all these parades decide to honor you or to have you participate in them. So I'm wondering what your sense is of how the corporations, because it's not just Coca-Cola and Goya and JetBlue, it's the Daily News, where I used to work, also pulled out. NBC, Telemundo also pulled out of the parade. Your sense of how these corporations are trying to impose their perspective on what is acceptable in these Puerto Rican Day parades?
Well, I think that every committee that is in charge of a parade has the right to do whatever it deems necessary to do. We have to respect that. It is their power to do so. Now, for me, corporations can do whatever they want to do with their money. That's their prerogative. But the prerogative of the Puerto Rican Day Parade in New York City to choose whomever it wants to choose to participate in the parade, it should not be determined by corporations. We cannot accept that. Let the Puerto Rican community, let the Puerto Rican committee make its decision, not to be imposed by anyone, not to be accepted. Because if we accept impositions, we will never move. We will never feel empowered to do the things that we need to do for our communities and for our people. It's a question of empowerment. That's fundamental in this issue, and I think people are overlooking that, because who can take the power away from this committee, from the particular committee that chose or decided to honor me? I do not need the honor, definitely not. I will march in the parade as a very humble Puerto Rican. That's who I am. I love participating in the parade. But what I would detest very, very much is corporations imposing their values or their ideals on a committee that has every power to decide for the Puerto Rican community what its parade should be. If they were to do that to the Irish Day Parade, I believe that the Irish would be awfully angry at that. It has happened in the past. It has happened in the past, and we should not. Puerto Ricans should not allow in any parade to be dictated who to participate or what to do with the parade.
Governor Cuomo also said he would not participate. Mayor de Blasio is marching in the parade, and he said, "I'm very happy Mr. Lopez Rivera has declined the honor. I don't think it should have been offered to him. I think it's good he declined it because it was entirely distracting from the issue at hand, which is Puerto Rico." He said, "This is one of these things where you watch and recognize the most important thing is getting lost. 3.5 million people are being mistreated by their own government right now, by the U.S. government." What is your response to Mayor de Blasio saying he will march, but that he is happy that you declined the honor?
Well, if he's happy, that's great. I believe people should be happy. If he's happy doing that, as long as he doesn't tell the committee what to do. Now, he's not telling the parade committee what to do. So, if he's happy, great for him.
Did you decline the honor?
One thing for me, the issue became something that would make the parade less functional. It would divide people. There's no reason for that, and so for me, it was a question of who should be honored. And I think the Puerto Rican people should be honored. I believe that it should be a day of celebration for all Puerto Ricans, something that we can enjoy, something that we can really, really celebrate, and that's for me what matters the most. And I'll be marching in the parade.
And are you welcoming other people to join you as well?
I have asked many people to, and they're coming from Puerto Rico, they're coming from Chicago, they're coming from Pennsylvania. So even from Orlando, there will be some Puerto Ricans coming that we have invited. So hopefully that more and more Puerto Ricans will participate this year than the last year. So let's hope for that.
And what do you want to see for Puerto Rico now?
Well, I think that Puerto Rico should be seen as a place where decolonization can take place. I see Puerto Rico at a moment when the United States government has finally admitted that Puerto Rico is a colony. So for us, it's not the problem that we had before. For us, decolonization is possible. One of the things that I have talked about is that the common denominator among Puerto Ricans who love Puerto Rico is the love for Puerto Rico, and that decolonization could bring all Puerto Ricans from the diaspora and from Puerto Rico together to decolonize Puerto Rico, just based on the fact that we love Puerto Rico, that Puerto Rico is our promised land, that we need Puerto Rico to be decolonized. Colonialism is a crime. We should erase that. We should erase that and allow Puerto Ricans to exercise their self-determination and to make Puerto Rico the nation that it has the potential of being.
Well, we want to thank you very much, Oscar Lopez Rivera, for taking this time on your time in New York as you march in the Puerto Rican Day Parade to make this your first interview in this visit. Thank you. Oscar Lopez Rivera is a Puerto Rican independence activist who was freed last month after serving 35 years in prison. And we want to ask Juan Cartagena to stay, President and General Counsel of Latino Justice. I know you have many official visits to make and must leave the studio now. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is Democracy Now! We'll be back in a minute.
Siempre hubo madrugadas para la noche más fiera. Siempre una primavera borró una huella invernal. Siempre hubo mariposas para la flor más ajena. Y para una vida en rejas habrá al final libertad. Siempre el puño del pueblo tiró gigantes al suelo. Siempre con la sonrisa venció la mueca feroz. Siempre con el amor el odio pierde terreno. Pues hay que ganar terreno para cimentar el amor. ¿Y qué dirán los que te engañaban viendo una patria crecer mañana? Te pedirán, Puerto Rico mío, la compasión. ¿Y qué dirán cuando la bandera, la borincana, la verdadera, le entregue al aire pegada al cielo su corazón? Esperando está la historia, tu salto grande al futuro. Y el viento tendrá seguro qué cosa hacer.
Siempre con Puerto Rico, always with Puerto Rico, by Amaury Perez Vidal. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Before we talk about the testimony of James Comey, we wanted to end our conversation with Juan Cartagena, President and General Counsel of Latino Justice.
Juan, I wanted to ask you again about this situation with the parade now and the enormous controversy and firestorm that's resulted, and how many leaders in the Puerto Rican community are reacting, because there's been a lot of attention on the corporations that have pulled out, but there are hundreds of community organizations that regularly participate in the parade. To my knowledge, none of them have pulled out.
That's correct.
So I wanted to get your sense of the impact on the community of this enormous firestorm over Lopez Rivera being there.
Well, I think it's galvanizing many more people to show up for the parade. I mean, it's one of these things that everyone recognizes, that who are the corporations to tell us who to recognize and who to honor. I want to flip this around for a quick second. Could you imagine having this parade in June of 2017 and not inviting Oscar Lopez Rivera? The criticism on the parade committee would have been just as big. We understand that he's a symbol of so many things, including resistance, that having him in the parade is just another way to elevate not only his personal story, but also elevate all we are as a people.
In fact, didn't the committee for years call for his release?
Of course. Of course.
The Puerto Rican Day Parade Committee.
This is the same committee that applauded Lolita Lebrón marching the parade. The same committee that dedicated a parade one year to Don Pedro Albizu Campos. So we're talking about an amalgamation of individuals for various viewpoints of the status of the island having that ability to be recognized by a parade.
And for young people who don't know who Don Pedro Albizu Campos was.
Albizu Campos, a nationalist leader of Puerto Rico, who was a famous attorney and dedicated his entire life to the independence of Puerto Rico, and was also, by the way, convicted of sedition. And Oscar said it so well today. Up until the 1980s, for 50 years, the crime of seditious conspiracy was only lodged against Puerto Rican independentistas. So it's an amazing place to be now that he's finally free and able to talk about these things.
And the reactions of the politicians, Mayor de Blasio, Governor Cuomo, Chuck Schumer.
Cuomo won't be marching.
Cuomo won't be marching.
Schumer will not be marching.
Yeah,
Schumer's not marching.
Yeah, Schumer's not marching.
Mayor de Blasio is.
De Blasio is. Of course, Melissa Mark Riverito will be front and center. She has been a champion of this cause for so long. She needs to be applauded. And so many other elected officials will be there.
She welcomed Oscar Lopez at the airport last night. She went there to...
I'm sure she would, and I'm sure she did, because that's exactly who she is. I understand the Bronx Borough President, Ruben Diaz Jr., will be there. There'll be many people. And Oscar said it so well today. This is a celebration of entire diaspora and the people of Puerto Rico. There are many other honorees. There's incredible honorees from music, from baseball, up and down the line. So I look forward to marching, and we all look forward to being Puerto Rican for a day.
The Yankees pulled out?
Yes, Yankees also. They were one of the first ones to pull out, yes. Not unexpected, you know.
Well, I want to thank you, Juan Cartagena, and final comments that you have on this very significant day that is not only the day of the New York Puerto Rican Day Parade, but it's also the day of the plebiscite in Puerto Rico that several of the parties are boycotting.
Sure. And the ironies are just enormous here, right? We're celebrating a day in which we, as a country, try to celebrate yearly, and this is an amazing opportunity for us to elevate the voices of so many Puerto Ricans across the board. The fact that I get to see Oscar Lopez Rivera free after I visited him in a penitentiary in 2015 with Natasha Banan from my office, who's also the president of the National Lawyers Guild. We both went with his attorney, whose name needs to be elevated all the time. Jan Sussler is an amazing attorney. And what she has done to ensure his commutation is something that has to be applauded. So we thank her, and I actually live to see the day that Oscar can breathe as freely as anybody can in a colonial regime.
And this is the, you mentioned a colonial regime, this is the 100th anniversary of the imposition of U.S. citizenship by the U.S. Congress in 1917. A citizenship that was imposed despite the complete opposition of the elected leaders of Puerto Rico who voted against it. It was still imposed on Puerto Rico.
That's right, Juan. Another level of contradiction.
And yet still, Puerto Ricans cannot vote for President of the United States.
Yes.
That's correct.
Well, thanks so much.
Thank you both of you for doing this.
Juan Cartagena, President and General Counsel of Latino Justice. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report, as we go to another top story of the day. Juan?
Well, former FBI Director James Comey will tell a Senate panel today that President Trump repeatedly demanded his loyalty and pressured Comey to end the probe into former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. Comey, who was fired by Trump last month amidst a growing FBI investigation into Russia's role in the November U.S. election, released his planned opening remarks to lawmakers on Wednesday, ahead of his highly anticipated appearance today before the Senate Intelligence Committee.
In Comey's statement, he reveals he was summoned to the White House for a one-on-one dinner with the president on January 27th, a week after President Trump was inaugurated, where Trump asked whether Comey wished to keep his job before declaring, quote, "I need loyalty, I expect loyalty." Comey states Trump later asked him to lift the cloud of the FBI's investigation into ties between Russia and top Trump officials. Comey also states that during this Valentine's Day meeting a few weeks later in the Oval Office, Trump asked other top officials, including Attorney General Jeff Sessions, to leave the room before asking Comey to drop the investigation into General Michael Flynn, the National Security Advisor who was fired, saying, quote, "I hope you can see your way clear to letting this this go, to letting Flynn go. He is a good guy, end quote. He had been fired. Trump fired him. Flynn the day before. For more, we go to Democracy Now! Video stream with Marcy Wheeler, independent journalist who covers national security and civil liberties, runs the website emptywheel.net, speaking to us from our home in Michigan. Marcy, talk about the statement that was released. We're about to see the actual testimony, but what you were most struck by and what Comey has to say.
I was particularly struck by details of the meeting that you described, where Trump asked all of his top national security officials to leave the room and then asked Comey to drop the investigation into Mike Flynn. The details in there are really interesting because he describes Sessions kind of lurking, and then he leaves, Attorney General Sessions. He describes Jared Kushner as the last one to leave, and then Trump asks him to leave as well. And there's this sense, Comey is great at drama. There is this sense that he is inviting questions about those two who have been implicated in this investigation, as if they wanted to be part of the request to drop the investigation into Mike Flynn, as they might be, because I've pointed out, and others have, that Flynn would have testimony against Jared Kushner, against the son-in-law. And so this all seems to invite questions that will be dramatically revealed just in an hour.
And Marcy, it's also unusual for someone who's going to testify, especially a former top official, to release their testimony a day beforehand, almost setting up the coverage that is going to occur today.
Right. I mean, this was covered internationally. It showed up in the Irish press in full form. But I also think that Comey, again, the man knows drama. He knows how to get headlines. I think he was trying to undercut a kind of pathetic effort by the part of the Republicans to smear him. And as I understand it, he did ask for this to be released himself. So he's sort of orchestrating this grand release so as to I guess, get enough attention to push back against any of the counter narrative that the Republicans are trying.
And ultimately, what this will feed into, what the testimony of Comey will feed into, and do you think it could lead to, perhaps an obstruction of justice charge against the sitting president of the United States?
Well, it's clear that it gets pretty close to that, and we don't even know all of the details about how Trump might be exposed or how Kushner might be exposed. It is a first step. We also have the testimony, or the non-testimony from yesterday, Admiral Rogers and Director of National Intelligence Coates, who refused to say that Trump hadn't asked them about this. It's quite clear that he did, and that they kind of gave soft executive privilege to the president so that they didn't have to declare that in the testimony, in the open testimony yesterday. So they're kind of complicit. Sessions seems complicit. Kushner seems involved. So it gets really messy really quickly.
Marcy Wheeler, we want to thank you for being with us. Independent journalist who covers national security and civil liberties, runs the website emptywheel.net, speaking to us from Michigan. And that does it for our show. I'll be speaking tonight at 6 o'clock at the Walter Reed Theater at Lincoln Center. That's Thursday. On Saturday morning in Chicago at the People's Summit at 9:30 in McCormick Place. And then on Sunday at Green Fest at 1 o'clock at the Jacob Javits Convention Center here in New York City. You can check our website at DemocracyNow.org. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Renee Feltz, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener, Sam Alkoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Massoud, Sharina Nadura, Andre Lewis, Amel Ahmed. Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, and Paul Huckabee are engineers. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Julie Crosby, Hugh Gran, Anthony Manzo, David Prude, Ariel Boone. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Thanks so much for joining us.